Nick Steele, and thanks for joining us today. The correlation between ministry behaviour and burnout with Valerine Ling. We have a stack of questions. What is the relationship between clergy leadership behaviour and burnout? How does destructive leadership behaviour relate to burnout? And what about conflict at church? How does a minister being the target of, if you like, personal violence correlate to thoughts of quitting? And what are the differences if you're in a solo ministry role or part of a team, and a team leader or a woman member of the team? Valerine Ling is our guest. She is a friend of the Pastor's Heart. She has just completed a survey of a stack of ministers in this space, and she's here to share the early results. She leads the Centre for Effective Living and the Centre for Effective Serving here in Sydney. And Valerie, thanks for coming in again. And I mean, you've just done this big survey and it's right hot off the press. You finished it like a week, 3 weeks ago or something. And
Friday.
Okay. And so here we are with the scoop. What's going on in the heart of the minister?
Well, it seems like these are the people who actually answered my survey. They're the ones that hung around, Dominic. So I think they're tired, they're exhausted, but they're trying their best to hang on in ministry. But at the same time, a number of them are really struggling to do that.
Struggling?
So my survey revealed that first of all, it was almost 200 people of Australian clergy. So I was quite narrow in my definition. They had to be Australian. They had to be in church ministry. And just over a third of them had serious thoughts of quitting the ministry in the last 12 months. A further third of them have actually sought help, like therapy or from a psychologist or a counsellor. And quite a number of them are exhausted.
And the relationship between behaviour, clergy leadership behaviour, and burnout?
So the reason why I took this long journey to finish this research was 2 years ago I thought I'd have a sabbatical. My particular area of focus has always been in clergy burnout. You've had me talk about that quite a bit. But right before COVID hit, I started to notice another type of dynamic. It was really leadership, church staff dynamics that were causing a lot of problems in their mental health. And leadership is an area that I have lived experience in. I myself lead a team of about 20 staff, so I understand that it's important to think about leadership, but I really wanted to do some formal study in it. So I took 2 years. It wasn't planning to take 2 years, but COVID hit, and then we had some really difficult ministry experiences ourselves. And then I really wanted to look, even before any of that happened, what is the relationship? Why is it that such horrific dynamics start to happen between a pastor and his team and a pastor and a congregation? And is there any relationship to maybe exhaustion? And I'll finish by saying one more thing. The other thing that really burdened me is, because I'm a clinical psychologist, phrases like he's a bully or he's narcissistic really trouble me because there are other explanations and other words that we can use to try to understand what's happening.
Go on.
So my main research interest, because I was seeing it happen in the practice, was that is there a possibility that pretty significant conflict adds to the burnout load that a minister has, which then crowds out space for him to think and rest and reflect, and actually puts him or her, because we had all kinds of ministry folk answer who were working for the church, into a position of feeling threatened. And is there a relationship even beyond that when someone is feeling threatened? Because as psychologists, we see this happens, that you're going to, at some point, when you're backed into a corner, try to get yourself out of it. And one way is to fight back. So is it possible that this pressure cooker environment that clergy are finding themselves in has a relationship to then some what we call in the literature destructive leadership practices?
Now, you did the research on two different leadership styles, the transformational leadership and the servant leadership style. What was the issues there?
Essentially, part of my research question was to try to figure out whether the way that we lead or the leadership behaviors that we use, does that also contribute to feeling burnt out? And what I discovered was that, not to say that this is the definitive range of leadership styles, but these are two types of leadership styles that are quite related, but they're quite different. Transformational leadership and servant leadership are very popular leadership theories in the broad leadership research, if you like. Transformational leadership is about working through people. So it's high on working out how to convey a vision, to communicate, to inspire, to influence, and to chart a course and a direction that's moving people towards seeing the same vision and the same picture. If that makes sense. Servant leadership is a rather old theory of leadership. Now, both leaders need to be servant-hearted, but servant leadership as a way of leading is very much invested in meeting the needs of your people. So you're in the mix, if you like, trying to serve and care and give and develop and nurture the needs of your people and your team, often at the expense of your own. So there's a sense that to be a true servant leader is to be very people and team focused, right? So I actually found the connection that there are certain aspects of burnout, particularly in the leading others aspect, that was more correlated with servant leadership. Now, I can't say which caused which, but let's just say that there is a trend that ministers who have a very hands-on doing lots approach to ministry and leadership were more burnt out than those who had a more doing ministry through others, through the leading of, through vision and inspiration and communication.
Mm-hmm. And you could see a quite clear correlation there?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that all of my correlations were strong, but this has probably been established in other bodies of literature as well. It's just that we haven't looked at clergy per se.
Right.
And the ministers that probably used this style tended to be solo.
The servant leadership ones.
Servant leadership ones.
Yeah.
They tended to be solo. And they had not had intentional training in leadership either. So there's a kind of a sense of, if you haven't, maybe, right, because again, I don't know which direction it goes, but if you don't have any intentional input to figure out what does it mean to lead servant-hearted, there are other different ways that can be sort of more life-giving than just sapping from you doing everything.
So you've talked about the correlation between the transformational and the servant. Yeah. The correlation between the solo and the team?
So that one, it mainly came out that ministers who were solo tended to have higher levels of, I measured external burnout, which is the burnout that comes really from leading others, from the interpersonal relationships. And I think that's been established in some other surveys as well. Any
theories or anecdotes of where you've seen this play out?
Well, I suppose it comes with the workload. You can't share the workload. And particularly if you're also then responsible for all of the pastoral care as well, that can be quite a heavy burden. I think the church that we serve, people, human beings, society have gotten a lot more complex. The governance has gotten more complicated as well. So it's quite a lot for one person to juggle if they're already tired and exhausted from, struggling through COVID. Yeah.
Destructive leadership behaviour and burnout. What's the thesis there?
So I want to define it a bit more. Destructive leadership is not well defined in any reading. It ranges from being unhelpful. So unhelpful meaning, turning things in late, being absent, not being very present as a leader, all the way to abusive. So overtly using power and overtly using strength and force to muscle people your way. It is a range. I pegged it somewhere in the middle. I use the term destructive leadership not to refer to abusive leadership, but I basically asked pastors to be honest. And I spoke with another friend of the pastor's house, Archie, and he didn't think we would get any good results, and I agreed with him, because who's going to tell us if they're using destructive leadership? You normally have to ask other people to weigh
about
in.
somebody else.
Yeah, exactly. But I got some results. So I asked pastors to reflect honestly, in the last 12 months, did you use blaming tactics? Did you use punishing tactics? You know, would you have considered yourself to be arrogant? So I asked these questions, and that's got to do more with a form of leadership that is not only it's not passive, it's actively now being unhelpful, but
or
not
reacting
quite
reacting in anger. Yeah.
but not quite abusive. So I pegged it there. And what I discovered was, thank you to all the ministers who were honest about their real, true leadership behaviour, it was pegged to burnout. There was a relationship that I found that when you're tired from the dynamics that come from, particularly that interpersonal dynamic, there's a relationship then to utilising some of these strategies that it's not appropriate, it's not good leadership. Sounds like something's going on though, isn't it?
So what do we do?
Well, there's a couple of more things that I discovered, and that is, in general, clergy burnout had a relationship with lower levels of self-insight and higher levels of superficial emotional engagement. Right, so what this means is, and this happens to me all the time as a leader myself, something happens in the practice. If I'm tired, if I've got lots of other things to do, I push it aside. I don't want to think about it. I don't really want to dwell on it, right? Because the minute I think about it, it brings up all these annoying feelings. I'm annoyed, I'm irritated. But if I leave it there, the quality of my decision isn't going to be great either. Right, so I've got to make time, I've got to make space to attend. I call it the bunch it up effect. I won't react to things immediately. I say I'll have to bunch it up for my time when I actually sit and reflect. I think the part of what we're seeing is that when we're in ministry and we don't have the time or the space or the capacity to do that, we just push down those emotions and we just make all of the decisions up here. After a while, it just doesn't lead to quality decisions. So there was also a relationship to burnout, so exhaustion, and not engaging really in those ways of reflecting on our thoughts, but also what we feel.
So how do we change our week, change our month, whatever, so that we can actually do that emotional processing and reflective processing you're talking about?
So this goes back to the original work I started in the burnout space. We do need to look at not just our workload, but our work type. That part of the work of a minister is to have space, time to do that. It is about resting your brain, resting your body, and increasing your capacity, therefore, to think and feel these things. But it is also about knowing that there are certain dynamics in the church that are stronger than what the average population deal with. Now, one of the things I hear a lot is, if our parishioners are working 5 days a week, shouldn't we top it up and say we work 6 days a week? Well, I kind of think it just depends, right? Because the other thing my survey found, and I don't know if we'll get to it, but the level of conflict that ministers are exposed to is actually quite significant. So if we don't take time, if we don't make space, if we don't reduce the load on our ministry folk, it's quite unsustainable, in my opinion. That's a strong statement to make, Dominic.
Well, unpack it for me. Yeah.
So we need to look at probably how we're actually designing roles in ministry, understanding how much responsibility is being placed onto the plate of a minister, the quality of the connections that they have with their congregation also matters. If you have a church that has a lot of conflict or a lot of pastoral issues, then we've got to contrast, not everybody can do the same load in those situations. But also what's happening in your personal life. If you've got children with special needs, if you're caring as well for elderly parents, if you've got those aspects, there's a demand on your load as well. So there are two things I mainly say. It's death by 1,000 paper cuts in ministry. And it only takes one more small paper cut to say, that's it, I've got nothing left. And the second is that it's an all-of-life vocation, if you like. Lawyers, psychologists, doctors, dentists, we go home. But pastors, they stay in, often living with their congregation, and they don't have an escape. Yeah.
There are some boundary things you can do, but it's not the same. Yeah.
I think you probably can come up with a bunch of really helpful boundary things. I think the latest thing now is we can be a little bit too over-boundaried. I think we need some help and some wisdom. So I find having a mentor, having people that you can talk with to get that wisdom, to figure out how do you actually make things work for yourself is really important. Yeah.
You did there was a survey of well-being of school principals, and you took some of the questions that you'd asked school principals and you asked senior leaders of churches the same questions. And what were the differences there?
Yeah, so that's a Australian school principals wellbeing survey that's not done by us, but it's been done for a few years now, just tracking the wellbeing of principals. And over the last decade, and particularly through COVID, the well-being of school principals, Australian school principals, is really of a concern. And one of the sets of questions that they asked in that survey had to do with the amount of personal violence that principals had experienced. And I thought, I wonder if I'll just ask the same questions. It was literally a last-minute throw-in. I just threw it into the last minute.
I mean, and personal violence, that's in the context of Christian church, that sounds like a big word.
Yes, yeah. Sexual harassment, physical assault, threats of violence, feeling bullied, gossip and slander, conflict and quarrels, and unpleasant teasing. Now, it's there, right?
You threw the question in. What were the results?
So for something like conflicts and quarrel, the majority, about 55%, would have said that they deal with that at a personal level on a regular basis. But gossip, slander, unpleasant teasing, that's there. Now, they were all correlated. So you were likely to be the target of all of those things, not just one of those things. And that was associated, of course, with burnout and also associated with thinking of quitting the ministry. Yeah. So it's quite sad to me. I think when I was going through the statistics for that, I really felt not just horrified, but so sad. Because, Dominic, that level of conflict uses rejection and ostracizing someone and personally attacking, that changes people's brain chemistry. We know that for a fact as psychologists. So not only are our clergy being altered in their mental state because of stress and exhaustion coming from workload, they're also being altered by the level of conflict that they're experiencing on a regular basis and very often can't escape.
Are we in a worse position than the school principals, or are we in a better position than the school principals?
I'll have to do the analysis, but I don't think we're in quite the position as the school principals are at.
Which you'd hope would be the case.
Yeah,
but we're talking secular school principals, yeah.
I think it's all. Yeah. And with the school principals, they also tag what they call a red alert email. So they actually have a mechanism to actually track to see what principals are actually sending out for help, and the level of self-harm and suicidal thinking for Australian school principals is quite alarming. We don't want to get there. We really don't want to get there.
Back to solo ministers. What's the word to solo ministers? Is there a future for the solo minister? Do we have to switch everyone into teams, or can we keep going in solo ministers?
I'd have to do the PhD on that one, Dominic. I don't know. What we see...
Because you did say that the solo minister was finding it tougher than the guy in a team, I think.
Yeah. I don't know what the future of it is, but we've also seen, if you think about my stats, it was about over 30%, but there is, 60 to 70% of ministers who are okay. And what we see in that is that they've got positive well-being ingredients, so all the things that we've talked about to prevent burnout, but they often have great support networks. I've often seen anecdotally that when you've got church leadership, even if it's lay leadership, that is healthy, you're not alone as a solo minister if you have that. Different things, the size of church and all of that really matters as well. So I think the word is that you probably need to not accept that this is a reality, and to find ways to surround yourself with support, encouragement, time off, different ways of doing ministry even that reduce the load that they've put onto themselves, and whatever that mechanism might be.
What do the results show us about women in ministry versus men in ministry?
So the women that did respond to my survey, and there weren't that many because there aren't that many
across the board,
were more burnt out than their male counterparts. And I've been dialoguing with a female clergy person in Baptist circles and just been asking her what's her experience has been. And what she said also got me really thinking, Dominic, if we have this level of conflict in the church, there is a statistic that establishes that women are more exposed to things like sexual abuse and things like that. So for a woman to be in ministry burnt out and being exposed to this level of conflict is really hard going. And that's really what I see in my practice as well. By the time we receive women who have been either pastoral assistants or children's workers or whatever, the combined impact of caring for family, bearing all of that stress and being a part of really strong conflict in ministry and being tired by ministry, I have to prescribe immediate rest for them usually. Immediate, because I get really concerned about the state of their mental health at that point. Yeah, so they're a vulnerable group.
Much of the discussion about burnout up until now has been about identity. And it seems you're moving into really the sense of belonging and how I relate to those around me. Do you just want to unpack some of those issues for us?
Yeah, I'd say the first part, which has got to do with ministry stress and perfectionism and some of the things that we take on, has sometimes got to do with our own expectations for ourselves. That, to me, has got to do with identity and understanding that Jesus doesn't expect us to be perfect. What I've now become concerned about, or where I'm now focusing on, is how do we now belong to one another? In my opinion, and I'd love to know what you think about this, when it comes to doing work, the Bible has some wise things to say about rest and masters and servants and all of that. But when it comes to how the body interacts, the Bible has loads to say about that. Jesus has things to say, Apostle Paul, we see in Revelations, what is said to the churches. And I wonder if we actually need to sit up and pay attention to how we are behaving as members of God's body, God's church, and as a family, if this level of conflict is existing right now. Yeah.
In terms of me and my body, you mean?
Yeah, the body of Christ. So there's a chemical. So this is now going into things where I'll have to spend more time thinking, because you literally got me. Friday I had it, and Monday.
And we were talking on the weekend. You said, I haven't done the analysis on that bit yet.
But it's exciting for me.
And I'm so grateful for you coming in and giving it this hot off the press.
Look, depression and anxiety, they've got a set of chemicals that moderate. So, dopamine, serotonin, that's got to do with how I feel as an individual. But there is another chemical that circulates, and I think it's God-given, and it's amazing, right? It's called oxytocin. It's the chemical of belonging. And it's what we as psychologists focus on, on releasing and nurturing when we're doing things like bonds between a parent and a child, in couples, in families. Now, the latest thinking is that in organizations, when you're trying to belong, oxytocin is the chemical that helps us in our brains to feel like we belong. Mm-hmm. But rejection, seeing you as being on the outside, you're not part of me, that really is destructive to building oxytocin. So what I'm now interested in is how do we help God's people to, inclusive of leaders, because leaders also have to recognize, how they're contributing to the dynamic of, not helping their body to gel together for whatever reasons. How do we now take what God says to us and obey what he says in terms of how the body is to interact with one another? But then how can we now have activities and put the brakes on things that reduce oxytocin in the body? Right. So an example could be, is it really necessary for us to be fighting about these things? When we do couples counseling, we would say that up to 70% of conflict is unresolvable. Mm-hmm. So focus on the 30%. Mm-hmm. If you really truly believe you're committed to one another, you love one another, focus on the 30%. So how do we actually start the conversation by going and saying, let's stop this level of conflict? How do we move the conversation now to what can we be united on and united in? And what are some of the behaviours that are acceptable and unacceptable when we're in that space? That's my latest thinking.
Well, let's think of application points then. We'll go application for the senior leader, application for the team member, and application for the parishioner or the church warden or the session. First, the senior leader. What do you want to say in terms of application?
I would say that as peers, let's not dismiss what we're hearing from other peers. There are still 30% that are struggling with some dynamics that you may not actually have ever experienced or currently be experiencing. So peers can support one another. You did your piece on, the 9 reasons why you would have resigned for that. Yeah. And I analysed that on my Facebook page and I went, here are all the things that Dominic had. And the big thing...
Well, we'll link to that in this point below.
The big thing for me was how important it is to have brothers and sisters to around you. So the first thing I would say is start bringing those people around you, pray and encourage and support, and be that for one another as well. And recognize that if you're starting to notice that if you're honest with yourself, and maybe you need someone to have this honest conversation with, it, you're starting to lead through force, through anger, something's not right. You need to talk to someone about that.
Yeah, if you become overly directive. Yeah. Actually, I'm just remembering at the beginning of COVID, a couple of my staff said, Dominic, you're becoming a bit too directive, and in that moment of the pressure, I actually became, I switched from being less collaborative, my normal, more collaborative style, to being more directive, and it was very helpful that they pointed that out to me, and that the way I was dealing with the pressure at that moment was to become more directive, and maybe that was necessary, maybe it wasn't, but it was something that they felt, and we at least needed to talk about it. Yeah.
And that takes a lot of psychological safety. That's something that needs to be built up. But I was recently listening to a leadership, I can't remember if it was a podcast or a training, but it was talking about the gift of self-awareness in your team. If you consistently bring that out and just say, let's just pause and let me just hear, what does this feel like for you guys? How does it come across? Now, if you don't have that as a senior minister, if you don't have a team, and you haven't inculcated that or cultivated that level of safety where people can tell you that, you need to surround yourself with some group that can, whether they're your peers.
So you're saying it was healthy that they were able to say that to me at that point.
Yeah. I mean, it's very important that we get feedback.
Yeah. What's your word to the team?
Well, this one is a bit tricky, isn't it? Because it really depends on the type of team relationships that you have. I suppose it's about cultivating belonging in the team. You don't want an us versus them. And if there are factions within your team, that needs to be investigated and looked at as well. So if we come back to a sense of belonging, how do we actually ensure, and I always say it's not about having pizza and going and I don't know what people do for team building activities anymore. We've got to learn to actually talk about, be vulnerable with one another. How are things going on at home? How are you feeling in this interaction? So I prefer to unpack the phrases like I feel intimidated, or I feel uncomfortable, or this is making me feel uncertain, right? We've got to get to the point where we can say this without jumping to judgments, which is, unhelpful. So being able to foster a sense of belonging and sharing vulnerability and making time and space to actually talk about that.
And the word to the parishioner? Yeah.
I'm going to be biased, right? So the whole reason I'm on the pastor's heart and I do the work that I do is my bias is that this might sound a little bit over spiritualized, but the church for me was my saving place. Jesus saved me from all kinds of crazy things that happen in my life. And so my bias is that regardless of who the minister is, that they continue to be able to share the saving grace of Jesus to other people. So my encouragement, I think, to parishioners is, what's the 30% that you can agree on? Get to know your pastor as a friend, and it's okay not to like them. You don't have to like them, but you're going to have to reconcile yourself to how you're going to love them. And I'll be blunt and say, and if you work that out and you have the conversations and it's just too hard to like and love them, you might have to go.
Right, okay.
It's one body, I think.
Yep.
We're all part of God's body. There are several different churches. Don't stay in a situation that you're going to be part of the dynamic that actually is destructive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for coming in.
Your pleasure.
My guest on the Pastor's Heart, Valerine Ling, and she is the director of Sydney's Centre for Effective Living and the Centre for Effective Serving, and it's been great to have her with this research hot off the press. You've been with us on the Pastor's Heart, and we will look forward to your company next Tuesday afternoon.